Okay, and now the next panel up, investing in mobility, the role of AI and robotics. How to move around has been a constant challenge for technology throughout the history of mankind. If you think about it, over the last 200 years, some of the most transformative technological changes have been around mobility and how we move around. So today we have a panel of speakers who are going to talk about new technologies, in particular AI and robotics, and how can they affect the way we move. To tell us more, in conversation with Rita Liao from TechCrunch, please welcome to the stage Tarun Davda from Matrix Partners India, Olaf Sackers from Maniv Mobility, and from Cathay Capital, Nicolas Ducret.
Hello. Welcome. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah. So we're talking about something very interesting that's going to change how we move around in the next 10 years. That's why we have some very distinguished investors here taking very different approaches in mobility. So why don't you give a brief intro of where you're from, what you've been doing in mobility?
So we are a global investment platform that spans between the US, China, and Europe. I'm based in China, but actually our fund is based in France. We manage 3 billion euros, and we invest abroad different sectors. In mobility, we're, for example, investors in Momenta in China. We're investors in Hitch in France, which is a ride-hailing platform, and a couple of other projects.
Hi, I'm Tarun Davda. I'm part of Matrix Partners India, which is an early stage tech VC in India with $1 billion under management. Typically invest at the seed to Series B stage. In terms of mobility, we've actually been pretty active in India. We were early investors in Ola, which is the largest ride-hailing platform in India. We recently invested in Ola's electric spin-out called Ola Electric Mobility, which just recently announced a round led by SoftBank last week. We've invested in Vogo, which is a scooter sharing platform in India. And we've also have an unannounced investment in the electric rickshaw space, which is a first mile, last mile solution around Indian metros.
My name is Olaf. I'm a partner at Maniv. Most VCs are investing in many different things and then kind of based in one geography. In contrast, we're investing only in mobility, and we invest in mobility at the seed stage, and then we work very closely with those companies to connect them to global car makers, suppliers, etc. So we're a specialist fund just focusing on the space. I'm based in Israel, and much of the team is based in Israel, in Tel Aviv, but we have somebody full-time in the San Francisco Bay Area. We just closed an investment in Australia and one in Spain. So we're looking very globally and very actively, and then we're trying to build this bridge that connects between mobility startups and the corporate partners that can help them succeed.
Yeah, cool. So Maniv's investment strategy is actually a very good reminder of how AI in mobility is not just autonomous driving. So maybe you could talk a bit about what are the other more interesting applications of AI in mobility? Because like Tarun, you said, autonomous driving may not come to India in the coming years. It may not happen at all. So what do you see AI being applied elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think it's a very interesting question. I think for those of you who've been to India, I think it's not hard to imagine why autonomous won't come to India anytime soon. We have terrible infrastructure and terrible driving sense, both coupled with each other. In terms of AI, though, I think there's a few applications, and across the 4 companies that I mentioned, each one is doing different things. But I would say broadly in 2 areas. One is safety, and the second is entertainment, right? And I'll just give one example of each. So Ola today, I mean, obviously, we have a lot of women passengers that drive on Ola. Ola has built technology today to actually, which uses AI and ML, to figure out if a driver is going off route, if the driver is driving, which may be unsafe in any way, if there's any sort of environment within the car that may be of a danger to the passenger. it automatically alerts Ola's sort of backend team that can immediately sort of intervene, right? Vogo, which is a scooter sharing startup, for example, a customer can go and unlock a bike through the mobile phone, but we need to make sure that these aren't kids and they're actually licensed drivers. And so we actually use AI to basically validate that the person is actually an adult with a valid driving license. So there's a bunch of applications within the broader aspect of safety that they do. Ola's also pioneered something called Ola Play, which is an in-car entertainment system, which is completely personalized, right? So when I sit in the car, it's almost a seamless experience from me. From my sort of Apple Music, I can transition directly to sitting in the Ola cab, watching the same Netflix movie that I watched last night, and I still have something remaining. So I think there are multiple ways in which they've done this, which is in my mind leveraging sort of how AI and ML works.
Right.
Haven't seen too much of AV as yet, though.
Yeah.
I think what's important to understand about AI is that it's not really like a thing like autonomous vehicles alone, right? It's not just a complete set of solutions. It's a tool for solving problems. So there are many different problems that exist in the world, and AI is being used across the spectrum of things. And so the question isn't what is AI, it's like what is AI for? Like how are we applying AI? What are we using it for? And when you look at the world of mobility, it's an industry that hasn't really changed for about 100 years. You know, cars still kind of work the same way, they structure the same way as the Model T. They're still sold in the same way. So now we have kind of this Cambrian explosion of new technologies that are happening in the industry where, technology is being applied in places it wasn't before. The car itself is becoming a platform for software. And AI is basically stuff that's built with software. So once the vehicle becomes a software platform, you can start applying AI and solving certain kinds of problems there. And then you're having this explosion of new business models, companies like Ola or Grab. And these companies aren't just ride-hailing companies that have to care about safety and security, et cetera. They're also becoming, like Grab is, a payments platform. And then you can apply a whole lot of other technologies there. So there's just such a wide range of things that are happening within the space that technology is being applied to. And then when you look at the field of autonomous vehicles itself, I mean, that's just a bonanza for AI, right? Like, autonomous development has become kind of a hub of attracting and developing cutting-edge AI. So what autonomy is not just AI, which has become kind of this thing that's applied everywhere. It's cutting-edge AI. It's the hardest AI problems. This is an extremely challenging problem. The reason it's not just really hard to do in India. It's really hard to do in like California or some really pleasant neighborhood where all the cars drive slowly and don't kind of cut across the lanes. So it's such a challenging problem because there's so much data, so much complexity that needs to be accounted for. But that's what's happening right now. And the reason is at the end of this tunnel, right? Once you solve this problem, there's such a huge opportunity, such a huge reward if you're able to create a system where cars can drive themselves and you can change.
Yeah, obviously, and then you have China.
So, I mean, the initial usage of artificial intelligence and machine learning has been to allocate a car to the right person when they're hailing a taxi or a car, and to make sure the best route is implemented, and also, calculating the ETA and things like that. That's the initial usage. What has been interesting in China is really what the cloud companies have been doing, trying to actually gather data from mapping apps, mobility apps, to put everything in the cloud and then to connect the traffic infrastructure, the traffic lights, to optimize the traffic and the flow of vehicles in order to improve the traffic. As you know, China has a lot of traffic jam problem in big cities, and actually we see some cloud companies actually gathering data from these apps in order to optimize the traffic and make the traffic go smoother.
On the other hand, it requires a lot of collaboration with local governments. Right?
Absolutely, and this cloud company actually are required, or basically governments, municipalities invite them to come over, and they are going to connect, the lighting system and all of the sensors in the street to the cloud platform to actually make this happen.
And I think that again highlights another really interesting aspect of this industry, which is that it's not just bits and bytes; it's atoms that need to move, right? So you're starting to bump up against places where people move, and therefore regulation. So in order to solve these kinds of problems, you basically have to deal with these collaborations across companies, across kind of bridging the analog and the digital, and then I think there's this interesting problem of the data is all siloed. Sometimes the data doesn't exist. So on the one hand, we've got certain kinds of things that we can solve, but we don't have the access to the data, or it's siloed, or it hasn't been collected. And on the other end, with say autonomous vehicles, you've got some of the data, but it's really hard to manage. That's where it's a cutting-edge AI problem. But the other problems are much more social problems or strategic problems. And so you see this interesting combination when investing in this field between having to solve people problems and social problems and think really creatively about business model and strategy. And on the other hand, deal with technology problems. You're not just, there's some of the most advanced silicon that's going into cars right now, algorithms for autonomous technology, etc. So you got this whole combination of really interesting tech and really interesting problems to solve, all bundled into one.
Yeah, and the VCs are not the only players. There are also like corporate VCs. So in terms of the role that VCs play in mobility, how are you working with like Ford and Daimler are also invested in a lot of mobility startups. So what roles do you see VCs play in the mobility?
Maybe I start. So we actually a hybrid model. Roughly 40% of our investors are corporates, and some of them are actually players of the mobility and car industry. And we have this approach where we look at investment opportunities in different countries, innovations, and so on, and we expose them to these companies. And when we find interesting opportunities, we invest, and they can co-invest with us. And sometimes we don't want to invest, but they're interested in investing, we can support them. And all of this field knowledge that we gather, we share with them. So and from the perspective of the portfolio company, it's also industrial resources they can use for their own developments and for potential partnerships.
Yeah, I think at least in India, the biggest application has been actually improving public transport. So if I look at typically the amount of public transport that's available per 1,000 lives in India, it's probably the lowest in the world right now. And so a lot of the sort of applications that we are funding is how do we just make it easier for people to get from point A to point B using sort of cheap means. And so there's a lot of stuff around metro lines that are happening, and that brings forth very interesting problems on first mile, last mile, right? Which is you can use a metro line to go a long distance, but you still have the last mile or two that one needs to cover. And can you find low cost, convenient, flexible sort of options that you can provide citizens? Now, while you're doing that, the reality is you're going to start hitting upon certain sort of government regulations which were archaic and built like 100 years ago and haven't kept pace with how convenient and how different these applications are, right? And so we're working very closely with the government in many cases to educate them and bring awareness about, hey, here are the new models, here is why it's benefiting citizens. There is nothing that sort of clearly either says this it's legal or illegal, but very often, as far as the government is concerned, anything that's new, anything that's disruptive, the instant reaction is, hey, we need to stop this, right? And so we're actually working very closely with them to generate awareness that, hey, this is actually good in the long run for consumers.
So just to go back to your question about strategic capital in this market, what we've basically found is that there are different hubs around the world where there's tech being created, and then there's car makers and suppliers and the rest of the industry, which includes oil and gas, rail logistics, a whole lot of different things. This is a huge global industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, and it's in the midst of all these disruptions that are happening right now. And the challenge is these are two completely different worlds, right? You've got startups on the one hand, which are creative and small and move quickly and don't have a hierarchy and structure. And then you've got these corporates that have succeeded for the exact reason that they're hierarchical and rigid. You're not going to make millions of cars each year that don't crash unless you have a very rigorous and thorough program. The problem is, if that's your methodology and the culture that you've built, it's very hard to work with startups. And so we're in this interesting moment because car makers realize that things are changing. Everybody went to business school and studied Kodak, right? They go to bed with Kodak pictures on their wall. They know about this risk of disruption. So they're all trying to get ahead of it, trying to figure out what they should be doing. But still, in order to build that bridge is a real challenge. And this is kind of where we come in. We're trying to help connect these tech ecosystems across the world with the right corporate partners. And then I think what's really interesting is that we're all aligned in terms of our goals. So the startups want to reach the corporates because they want to sell and they want to grow and become better companies. The corporates want to work with startups because they need new technologies, but they're only interested in the startups that are actually solving problems. So all they really want is a commercial agreement. If they're just doing POCs and stuff like that, that's not really solving their problem. And our goal is to create startups that are valuable and build these strong corporate relationships. So if we're connecting the right startups with the right corporates, then we're solving all of these problems. So we're creating these win-win-win situations. And what's also interesting is a lot of the zero-sum thinking that's dominated the industry for a long time. So if you've got a whole lot of car makers competing each other and a fixed number of suppliers, every one that does better is causing the other to do slightly worse. So it's zero-sum thinking. But tech doesn't work in a zero-sum way. If you have a startup, that startup is weaker if it's got less companies and stronger if it has more customers. So the more customers, the better for all of its customers. So the competitive dynamics in the market are shifting from a game of exclusivity to a game of velocity. Who can move fastest? Who can adapt the quickest? Who can find new ways to integrate technologies into the platform? And the risk for the car makers isn't that they're going to be beaten, that Daimler's going to beat BMW. It's that Google's going to come in and capture all of the value that BMW and Daimler both could have had. So that's the risk, and so collaboration is creating new opportunities.
Are you seeing the same dynamic in India and China?
Very similar, actually. So Ola already works with a lot of the car OEMs, the car manufacturers, both within India and globally. So we work closely with the Mahindras in India. We work closely with Hyundai in globally, which also invested in Ola. And it's the same thing. It's actually finding ways for both these to work with each other, because the way they think is very different. The way they operate on a daily basis is very different. But I think the shared common vision of building a better mobility infrastructure for the country is there. Also, I think some of these car OEMs have realized that the new business models are completely disrupting them. So in India, for the last 3 quarters, auto sales are coming down every year because essentially it's all moving towards shared mobility.
And what's fascinating about Ola is they're launching globally now. They're live in Australia. They're about to go live in London. So it's not just an Indian company; it's becoming a global company.
Yeah, that's right.
And in China, actually, you really have 2 kinds of OEMs. You have domestic ones and foreign ones. Domestic ones are very aggressive, actually, to support and encompass new technologies, AI, autonomous driving, and so on, mobility, and so on. Many of them actually have JVs with Didi, or they do their own mobility services. Foreign ones actually are fighting to stay relevant in that market, either OEMs and tier 1 suppliers. And because China, in a way, would be a relatively closed market for cars, and especially once you go into the AI layer, so they need to be able to work closely with domestic startups and domestic technology providers. And as a cross-border fund, we try to help them actually do that. Most of our investors are non-Chinese, but we help them work with Chinese startups.
And lastly, I want to go back to the question about regulation. You talk a lot about how in this field, regulations and government relations are very important. Do you see enough regulation in this space? Because I've had conversations with investors where they said this space is moving too fast, and regulations and questions around moral choices have not kept up with development of the industry.
So I think sometimes regulations are used as an excuse. So sometimes, companies developing autonomous vehicles, they say, we'll be able to launch once the regulations are ready. I think the real challenge is the technology. That's what's so hard. I think regulators know that autonomous technology will be transformative, and in many states, in the US, for instance, or a country like Singapore, are doing a lot to stay ahead. I think the danger, especially in a time of so much rapid change, is regulation that clamps down too hard and too reactively. I think you do need a stable state of regulation once these technologies mature. But what you want to do is allow the innovation to happen in the meantime. And you get this interesting situation right now where you got people in cities, a city like Tel Aviv, where they're fighting about the scooters on the street that are taking up the sidewalk.
Yeah.
But there's I think because this is such a contentious issue, they want to be reactive and over-regulate immediately. But I think they have to kind of deal with the cacophony for a while, allow it to kind of mature, and then kind of have careful and judicious regulations come in.
Okay. So with that, we conclude this panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.